Welcome back, everyone, to the International Forum on Social Media Disinformation, hosted by the George Washington University's Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Trimble. I am the incoming director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at GW, and I will be serving as moderator for our final panel, in part because Frank Sesno, who was originally scheduled to moderate, is having some technical difficulties. So hopefully we won't have more of those going forward. But I'm very grateful for everyone who has joined us on the panel, as well as those who are joining us as attendees on Zoom. For the journalists who are doing so, please feel free to submit any questions that you have during the panel in the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll monitor those and share those with our panelists if we have time and at the right moment. So our next panel is going to focus on the ways that disinformation is used to suppress voter turnout in elections through false information about the vote, intimidation, or disillusionment. But we're going to start now with a short video that will help us see a larger framework for the discussion we're going to be having today.
We devised an experiment where we created a fake organization's page on Facebook, along with a series of false and harmful ads. These ads were outlandish and false conspiracies, there was racist fake news in there, and there was voter suppression tactics. What we found was that we had no trouble getting the ads approved.
The fact is, right now, if you're a political campaign running for federal office, you can pay Facebook to distribute your lies.
I've seen a lot of different tactics be used on social media in order to discourage voters from participating in the electoral process. Some of those things include incorrect times of when polling sites are open and closed. I see incorrect places to go and cast votes. I've seen scare tactics.
Americans are creating fake accounts and pages on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media sites.
We thought that there'd be some tiny level of oversight from them, and there was nothing.
In the Latino community, we have witnessed serious problems with misinformation historically. But right now, we have very serious concerns with what is happening in social media.
A lot of the blame does rest with social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. They have within their power and within their rights to go through and keep disinformation and misinformation and toxic speech off their platforms. And for the most part, they've chosen not to.
Democracy is based on a few core tenets. One of them is an informed constituency, and what these platforms enable through the spread of misinformation, disinformation, is the undermining of that central tenet.
This country has a long legacy of citizens having to fight for their right to vote and fight for their voices to be heard. We've seen this with the Voting Rights Act. We've seen this in the suffrage movement. We've seen this throughout the course of history. And no organization, no social media platform has the right to uproot those rights that individuals in this country, citizens in this country, have fought and died for.
An incredibly powerful message from that video. And to join in sharing their perspectives, sharing their powerful messages today, we have three witnesses who can speak directly to the dangers to our democratic process. After we hear from these three witnesses, we'll hear from two distinguished lawmakers. Those lawmakers are Senator Mazie Hirono from Hawaii. Senator Hirono serves on the US Senate Judiciary Committee that has jurisdiction over anti-competitive behavior. Our other lawmaker is Phumzile Vandama, who earned a reputation for fighting corruption in her country's constitutional democracy. She's Shadow Minister of Communications in South Africa and an MP from the Democratic Alliance Party. She has firsthand experience exposing an election disinformation plot in South Africa that was initiated to distract from a government corruption scandal. It's a really fascinating story, and it was one that was fascinating enough to to warrant a film that you may want to watch. We're lucky that she's here to share her star power with us today. But before we turn to the lawmakers, we're going to begin with several witnesses. The first of those is Kylie Scales, who is the managing director of Black Lives Matter Global Network. And this network began as a rallying cry to end state-sanctioned and vigilante violence against Black people, and has turned into a major multiracial movement. Kylie began her career organizing and fundraising in Democratic congressional politics, but her work now spans the globe. She specializes in the startup phase of organizations and has done important work fostering local entrepreneurs in post-conflict countries such as Liberia and Afghanistan. She was the founding national director of Mentor USA, a branch of the International Drug Prevention Organization led by the Queen of Sweden. And over nearly 2 decades, her work has truly forced change around the world. We're delighted that she can join us today. Our second speaker will be, or a second witness, will be Hector Sanchez Barda, who is the executive director of Mi Familia Vota, an organization that unites Latino, immigrant, and allied communities to promote social and economic justice. He's also launched national campaigns to improve the condition of working families. His roots are in the labor movement, having served as executive director of the Labor Council for Latin America, the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement as a senior fellow at the GW Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute. He's the chair emeritus of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. And last but not least, we'll hear from Jocelyn Benson, who has been the Michigan Secretary of State for the past 2 years and brings a wealth of experience on this topic. She has an impressive string of credentials and activism, including her work as an investigative journalist, as well as a scholar, researching white supremacist organizations and neo-Nazism. 10 years ago, she authored State Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process, nearly a decade before her service in Michigan. She's clerked for a US Court of Appeals, and she served as Dean of Wayne State Law School, the youngest woman to have ever served as a dean of a top 100 law school. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all 3 of these witnesses. Kylie, if you wouldn't mind beginning, you're on the front lines of this fight at the moment. Please tell us what you're seeing and experiencing.
Hi there, thank you. I needed to get off mute. That's happened to me before. Thank you so much for asking me to participate in this conversation. It's very important. And so I'll just begin by saying the words Black Lives Matter were first used by an organizer in a love letter to Black people on a social media platform. Another organizer then hashtagged that phrase, and then like a flint, that hashtag sparked a viral reaction, setting an intention and making a promise to the entire world. The phrase started a global movement where organizers, activists, and people from all walks of life joined the call to fight for justice, freedom, and liberation. And it was all born online. The digital arena plays a pivotal role in organizing, in our lives, and in how we as citizens relate to power in this country. A key component of an effective democracy is a well-informed constituency. Now, how we are informed or disinformed is more crucial than ever. As with the movements and the movement leaders before us have experienced, we know there are countries, groups, and individuals actively working to undermine and manipulate the liberation work of Black organizers. In 2016, our organizers were among the first to notice international accounts that were uncharacteristic to our movement and posed a threat to our mission. Since then, we have worked to build the right structure, support, and technological tools needed to monitor, analyze, report, and take action. In addition to our own internal monitoring and reporting, we're empowering our community to flag suspicious behavior. Our organizers, constituents, and allies can now securely submit the potential disinformation they see to us via email on our website, and we will dig deeper. Though our organizers are routinely on the front lines and are no strangers to risk, we take very seriously disinformation and online threats that can lead to real-world attacks. Disinformation not only impacts, but in fact targets the Black organizing community and threatens the public discourse. International actors are, in increasing numbers, centering racial injustice and deliberately stoking the flames of discord in this country. And this is no accident. These fraudulent accounts are working to confuse, distract, and ultimately discourage organizers, Black people, and global citizens from taking progressive stands. They try to skew search results to appear bigger and more significant than they are. They use images of Black people and impersonate organizers and movement leaders. Ultimately, the goal is to cause chaos, harm, and lessen our power, but we will resist that fiercely. The examples are so many. The Mueller report called out fraudulent IRA accounts, co-opting the phrase Black Lives Matter. The recent Senate report stated 96% of IRA's YouTube content was targeted at racial issues and police brutality. This year, Facebook saw fraudulent social accounts called BLM News created by Iranian actors. And CNN reported that Russian-backed trolls in Ghana were being paid to infiltrate and influence Black Lives Matter conversations specifically. During the recent protests in this country, suspicious Facebook events were created in our name by groups other than BLM chapters. Material created to incite racial tension was distributed in our name and amplified across Facebook and YouTube's platforms. It's crucial at this time that we help our leaders, our lawmakers, and business leaders understand the impact of disinformation on the work of Black liberation, that our messages are being co-opted and misappropriated by international actors attempting to cause chaos and disorientation. Recently and disturbingly, during the 2020 primaries, we have seen attempts again and again to suppress the power of our vote with disinformation. These tactics range from direct voter disinformation on polling place closing times and intentionally wrong information about how to vote, to content clearly trying to intimidate voters and not to vote by using scare tactics. And as dangerous as many of these are, we also see disinformation trying to feed the notion and dissuade our community that voting just doesn't matter. These are all deliberate and insidious efforts to silence our voices where they matter most. We understand that, as history shows us, organized disinformation is a tried and true way to undermine the work of Black organizers, bring harm to us, and bring chaos to our communities. The recent changes that Facebook announced on Friday, while under pressure from advertisers, are just Band-Aids on deep wounds and not nearly enough. It's upsetting and deeply disturbing that social media platforms like Facebook are allowing this to persist today. The sheer reach they have makes them the most powerful source of disinformation on the planet, and they're profiting from it. They're choosing dollars over democracy, and it's undermining our freedom and our liberty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kylie. I'd like to turn now to Hector. Hector, you've been involved in campaigns for working families for years, and I'm particularly eager to hear how you've had to adapt to new tactics over this time.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. This is such a critical conversation that really goes to the heart of our democracy. It's a conversation on the basic evolution of where do we want to go as a nation, and how do we make this a better and more inclusive democracy. For us as an organization, we want to see this as an opportunity to open the possibilities for working class families. In our case, we work with the Latino and the immigrant community. And we work always on the front lines, and we see, I was personally in Orlando in the last presidential election, a Latino neighborhood. It was a 6 hours long line in a 95-degree, etc. We all are familiar with this kind of stories. But the message that we want to send is, how do we make the democracy during the difficult times that we're facing more inclusive, easier to access, with all the technology that we are discussing for good? In the context of what we're discussing with this misinformation, is information and misinformation that is using to cause harm to our democracy and mislead all of the different people that we see in the communities that we represent. We have seen this in the context of COVID, a lot of misinformation that is directed towards our community. Our families are in very serious need of the best possible information. We are mostly working class families, so we need the best and most reliable information, especially in the context of COVID. And these social media platforms have been playing a very negative role, misleading our families from that perspective. So that's in general the analysis of what we have seen in the context of COVID. But in the specific examples that we have seen with misinformation, and in Mi Familia Vota, we have 14 offices in 6 states, Florida, Texas, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and California. Some of these states are getting a lot of national attention because are swing states, and there is a lot of heavy investments from the topic on the issue that we are discussing. And I wanted to share just a couple of simple examples that we've seen, but this is just a small taste of what we're facing. And by the way, in the community, we have seen all the elements of misinformation in the past. For example, the grown dates in Spanish to go to vote, etc. But now we have seen an explosion of misinformation that is really affecting a lot of people. For example, just some examples that we had recently in the last couple of weeks, in our efforts in Colorado, a local elected official spread a flyer on social media that claimed that Mi Familia Vota is fighting Republicans and that we are advocating to open up the borders and dismantle the United States. This is something that we saw in the social media. And our name was actually next to other very good organizations like League of Women Voters, Color of Change, etc. Good organizations that are rooted in the communities. So this was one example that we identify in Colorado and that is happening. In Arizona, a state that is getting a lot of attention for the presidential election, misinformation is already being spread about undocumented immigrants voting in the upcoming election. We are also seeing a lot of misinformation about vote by mail. Most of this information is focused around voter fraud, which has also been tied to the idea that undocumented immigrants are going to vote in this cycle. This come aligned with all the misinformation and anti-Latino and anti-immigrant messaging that we have seen from the Trump administration from day one. Literally, we have seen a drastic increase on hate and violence against our community. Hate crimes against Latinos and immigrants increased 26% during the Trump administration. And we have seen this exclusion and constant attacks against our community from the policymaking point of view. So this is aligned with some of those devastating efforts that have very, very bad circumstances in our community. And another example that I want to be, just to contextualize how we see this all over the nation. Another important state for this presidential election, in Florida, we see a lot of misinformation about Democrats being socialists. These attacks are aimed at our Cuban and Venezuelan communities where we work in the I-4 corridor. So we see a lot of this kind of misinformation and tactics comparing any Democrat to communists or socialists in the context of what happens in the regimes in Cuba and in Venezuela. Obviously, we have a lot of spaces of information and education. Most of the work that we do is C3. We also do C4 work, but a lot of the education that we're providing to the communities so they understand where the different politicians stand. And right now we're launching a presidential campaign where we're gonna do voter guides and a lot of information and the most reliable information for our communities to make sure that not only we're fighting this misinformation, but that we have the right data and the right and the best possible information for the community. Just to close, we see this as a moment, a unique historical opportunity to make this a better democracy. And as an organization, we're providing the different tools so people have more access, and voting by mail is one of those elements. And a lot of the education via social media are some of the other different elements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both witnesses, Kylie and Hector, for sharing their experiences with this on-the-ground work. Unfortunately, Secretary Benson is also having technical issues. They seem to be taking over for us today, so we will continue on the best that we are able. And I'm going to turn now to Senator Mazie Hirono. I I'm very grateful to have you here with us today. Of course, people in the audience will know that Senator Hirano serves on the Judiciary Committee and on the Senate Commerce Committee and is an outspoken voice for vulnerable citizens all around the country. We're incredibly grateful for your participation, and I look forward to your remarks and your interaction with the witnesses that we have with us today. I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was good to watch your initial video to set the stage of this conversation, and of course to hear from Kylie and Hector. One correction, I don't sit on the Commerce Committee. I do sit on 4 other committees besides the Judiciary Committee, the biggest other committee being Armed Services. Keeps me busy. So we know that serving on the Judiciary Committee, and of course we watch what's going on with this upcoming election, we know that there will be massive voter suppression efforts being taken by foreign entities, as well as a lot of these groups that we really don't know very much about. They, as Kylie mentioned, they create private groups on Facebook, and then they put a lot of misinformation and disinformation online. So clearly these internet platforms have to do a lot more. You know, we all remember Mark Zuckerberg saying, Facebook is not the arbiter of truth, except that his platform is used in a massive way for a lot of misinformation and disinformation to get out to the public about all kinds of things, including voting and COVID. So clearly they need to do more. And I was just watching one of their global, whatever is Clegg, his name is Nick Clegg, I think, and he says, yes, they are doing a lot, but they can certainly do more. And of course, we see the initiatives being taken by some really large companies to boycott Facebook unless Facebook does more. Now, as a lawmaker, I am very interested in the immunity that these platforms have, and that's provided under Section 230. I am not a supporter of immunizing an entire, basically, industry from liability. I think we need to incentivize these platforms to do content moderation. And therefore, I am looking at making some changes to Section 230, which does provide them with total immunity, to take away that immunity and to require them to set up ways that they're going to do content moderation so that there is not all this hate speech, racism, and everything else on their platforms. So that's one of the things that I am looking to do. At the same time, I did want to ask, Hector, thank you so much for being such an advocate for immigrants. That is a particularly vulnerable group because this president has made it plain that he is very anti-immigrant. And there's already a lot of fear among our immigrant community brought on by things like the public charge rule, et cetera. And I know that there have been efforts in the 2018 midterm elections. We saw an increase in disinformation to the Hispanic community, for example, tweets claiming that ICE agents will be at polling stations on election day looking to deport illegals trying to vote. So do you think that that these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, these other platforms, that they should engage in outreach to the Hispanic community to do more than just expect you all to get the right information out to this community?
Thank
Hector?
you, and thank you for always being a champion for immigrant rights over there in Congress. It's so devastating to understand how heartbreaking it is for an undocumented person to live in this nation.
Yes.
We're a critical nation that takes advantage of their labor, and we don't want to give them an access to be fully part of our society. There is no legal line over there. It's really difficult right now in the different states where we're working, trying to provide just basic information and support. Remember that immigrants are being excluded from literally everything, included families with immigrant, mixed families in terms of status. They were excluded from this space. We have concerns also with a lot of the intimidation that we see, Senator. This happened in the past. In the last presidential election, we actually saw in some places ICE trucks being parked outside polling places. But this kind of misinformation is also something that has been making it really hard for these families. These families live in constant fear. They just go to
Mm-hmm.
buy their groceries and they go to work and they don't have any kind of life, even before COVID, because of the constant attacks from this administration. So we see a lot of those elements, and it's something that we hear is affecting the mental health situation of families and children, and just the basic way of life of our immigrant families in the nation.
So, Hector, and this is also for Kylie. How important is the opportunity to vote by mail to ease the fear among immigrant communities, and also just to enable people in this pandemic to be able to vote? How important is voting by mail, which of course the president is putting out a lot of false information about how that leads to fraud. Can both of you talk a little bit about the importance of voting by mail?
Kylie, if you want to start, and then I follow your comments.
Sure. Yeah, voting by mail is incredibly important, particularly now that we're in the middle of a pandemic. People shouldn't have to choose between their health and exercising their right to vote. So this is a very important time in our history to be able to empower people with the right information, the accurate information to be able to vote by mail. We also need to make sure that voting by mail removes any barriers. So we must make sure that folks are able to vote by mail and have the information that they need to, without barriers like postage needed or dates that are required to be posted by a certain date. We should make sure that votes are counted when if they are postmarked by election day, for example. We have to make sure that that signatures that they are able to provide a signature that is recognizable, that is not a barrier or a hamper to their vote being counted. And we must accurately educate all people on the proper way to ensure that their vote by mail is counted appropriately.
So my apologies that I need to step in here, but Secretary of State Benson has been able to rejoin us now, and so I want to give her the opportunity to share her statement with us, and then Senator Hirona, if you would like to ask her a question after she's done, we'll proceed that way.
Okay, thank you.
Secretary Benson, are you with us?
Yes, thank you, and sorry for some of the technical difficulties. I'm glad. Thank you for hosting this forum and for welcoming me today. And I was watching and enjoying the line of questioning, so I look forward to continuing to observe and get back. I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to thank you for having me here today. And as the Chief Election Officer for the state of Michigan, we are already seeing a lot of the misinformation that was referenced earlier in action, and expect to see much more of it in the coming months. So I'll just give two examples briefly of tactics that we've experienced in Michigan this year already, and then we can go back to the great questions and conversation that was ongoing. For the 2 points I just want to make are with regards to misinformation and then scare tactics. On misinformation, following Michigan's March 10th presidential primary, an image began circulating on social media that showed two BuzzFeed webpage screenshots with Michigan election results. In the screenshot supposedly taken earlier in the day, Bernie Sanders had 300,000 more votes than he did in the supposed screenshot from later in the day, suggesting that he'd been cheated out of 300,000 votes. The images, of course, were doctored. There were no disappearing votes. But in response to the post, our team reached out to BuzzFeed, got no response, and to Twitter, who said the post did not violate their rules. So we went it alone and explained how the post was fraudulent, how the image were doctored. I even at some point got calls from congressional representatives in our state asking if this allegation was true. And so it was frustrating at a time when we had to a lot of work to do to ensure our elections were going smoothly and reporting the results accurately, to have to address these doctored images that were circulating for several days, correcting them as they popped up. And certainly then Sanders supporters had seen the post, were demanding an explanation, were talking about it on various different talk shows. So that's just one example of misinformation that originated clearly from adversaries to the democratic process. and that was used to in some ways manipulate the supporters of candidates into thinking something had happened, and all the rest. And so that's one example that, again, it was in the March 10th presidential election in our state, the primary. The second example I wanted to share, and then we can get back to questions, were scare tactics. Ahead of our May 5th local elections in Michigan that were held in the height of a pandemic, elected members of the Michigan Republican Party and the party itself said that the election would put public health at great risk if we were to have it. We were able to demonstrate with facts that that was not the case, but they even said that the mail would transmit the coronavirus and that election workers would not have sufficient PPE to protect themselves. Neither of those things turned out to be true. We actually provided PPE for all election workers through the state. But this misinformation and scare tactics spread in letters to the governor that were shared with the press, and at least one Facebook post from the party in response to our recruitment of election workers. Facebook did not intervene in any way. And we see these again as scare tactics were in some ways testing the ability to scare the public into participating in an election. In the May election, it ultimately was tremendously successful. It drew record turnout. 99% of that were ballots cast through the mail, and we provided all clerks with PPE. There were no reports of fraud. No one got sick, but we continue to see these scare tactics used to suppress turnout and scare people from voting and scare people out of thinking that their vote's going to matter, that they are going to have to risk their health in order to vote, even if we assure them that that's not the case. In my view, both of these examples are in some case tests run by various adversaries for the fall election, and we're anticipating similar claims to be used to question the integrity of our elections as we get closer to November, and certainly after the fact, where we have results that potentially candidates may not be happy with, or former candidates may not be happy with. They'll use the work they're doing now to bolster their arguments that the election results should not be respected. So that's some of this what we're seeing in Michigan. I'm happy to now feed back into the Q&A, and thanks again for having me here today.
Thank you. And Secretary Benson, I don't know if you're aware that your camera is not actually on at the moment. Maybe that's part of the technical difficulties that you've been having, but if you can turn it on, we would certainly appreciate being able to interact with you face to face.
Okay. Every time I turn on, everything seems to freeze. So
does it go away? All right, then let's not take that risk then. Let's go ahead and leave it as is. It's a lovely picture that we can talk to for the moment anyway, and we can certainly hear you loud and clear.
Great.
Senator Hirono, did you have any questions that you wanted to pose to Secretary? Senator Hirono, you're actually muted at the moment.
Oh, unmute it. So, Secretary Benson, you've put out a number of examples, and there will be more coming down the pike for this election period. And so, eternal vigilance. Not to mention that when you sent out very reasonably absentee ballot application forms, the president attacked you and threatened to withhold funding for Michigan in the middle of the pandemic. So you have your work cut out for you. But is that one of the reasons that you partnered with Ohio to put together a civility task force to counter all of these kinds of misinformation and disinformation that seems pretty rampant in your state?
Yes, I mean, we do believe we need to join forces. That this is not a partisan issue, really. At the end of the day, it's just about ensuring our citizens are well informed. Civility and a task force on civil discourse is part of that. But really, also, it's communicating with community organizations and grassroots leaders and trusted voices in communities so that they can cut through the rhetoric. And that's going to be increasing and escalating in the months ahead, and speak the truth to the communities who trust them, and do so, again, rising above kind of the misinformation, but instead just kind of letting facts and data rule the day. And so we're partnering with other secretaries of state to be committed to that, and particularly in the states like Ohio, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina, where we know the rhetoric is going to be particularly focused.
Yes. And that's why it's so important that these internet platforms do more to do content moderation. When you think of the traffic, when you think about 1 billion posts on Facebook every day, and 500 million posts on Twitter every day. We're talking about massive amounts of misinformation being put out there. And they are not particularly motivated to do very much to get rid of this kind of false information because they have immunity under Section 230. That's one of the reasons that I'm focused on those changes. But one thing about the importance of voting by mail, I'm sorry that Hector, I don't think you got to get to it, but that is in danger even as we speak. The president is so much against being able to vote by mail that he has said that he doesn't want the Congress to provide any funding for the United States Postal Service, which if we don't provide that kind of funding, they could stop all mail by September or so. That's one of the major reasons that we want to get to another COVID package. We feel a sense of urgency that our elections are in jeopardy if we don't provide that funding to the Postal Service.
So we've now had an opportunity to hear a lot of the American perspective about voter suppression and how it spreads online. But I'd like to turn to our last panelist now to really share from a powerful perspective outside of the United States. Phumzile Van Dam, welcome to joining our panel. And I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And it's been very fascinating and helpful to listen to the other panelists. So good evening from a cold Cape Town. I know it's summer and daytime where you all are. Just to give a context of where we are in South Africa with disinformation. So we are currently in what has been the longest COVID-19 lockdown in the world. And when the virus started becoming a real problem in South Africa, our greatest fear was disinformation, because we saw it as important in fighting the virus and making sure that people have the right information. And whereas we have quite a high proliferation of cell phones, I think about 99.8% of people in South Africa have cell phones. Not as many have access to the internet. So the fight against any misinformation or disinformation about COVID was something that we started quite early on. From my role in the opposition, we have quite a strong civil society and non-governmental organizations that have been recently established with a particular focus on fighting against disinformation. We also have what I would describe as an activist media corps who have now started focusing on sort of forensic digital investigative journalism. So the way that we have responded to it is less through legislation, but more through dialogue. And the question that I have been thinking about a lot as a legislator is what role I can have in lawmaking in fighting disinformation. And it's quite a difficult thing to deal with here because we're a relatively new democracy, and sort of opening the door to any kind of legislation or regulation of the online space opens the door to government silencing free speech. So it's a very tenuous line that we have to balance, but I'm looking forward to engaging further with that. And I'm particularly interested in Kylie's perspective, because we've also been watching very closely the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a very important and noble cause. And it's crazy that this day and time we still need to explain to people, why Black Lives Matter and what it means. And instead, the opponents of that movement have tried to demonize people who are essentially, fighting for equality. So it's been a very interesting thing to watch. And I'm very interested in Kylie's perspective, how they are fighting what is a narrative war on social media. So we have a very active citizenry who are very averse to fake news, given our history, and I'll explain a little bit more about why that is. I saw a poll that listed us as second in the world for reliability on COVID information, and it's because people in South Africa cannot stand fake news. They cannot stand anyone who comes in and provides the wrong information, anyone who weaponizes race, like is being done to the Black Lives Matter movement. So just to explain how it happened. So fake news and disinformation started becoming a problem in South Africa in our 2016 election, which I think is the same time it became a problem in the US. So it was a very difficult position for us in the opposition because we weren't quite sure what to do. And it was less, I guess, a disinformation campaign and more of a misinformation narrative controlling perspective. And the way that it's done in South Africa is through racial polarization, given our history and the tenuous project of reconciliation in South Africa. So the matter started heating up through a firm called Bell Pottinger. There's a documentary called Influence, which I believe is out in the US, which you can watch, which gives a brief history about Bell Pottinger. But in summary, Bell Pottinger they don't exist anymore, was a big PR firm, London-based PR firm that worked with dictators such as Pinochet, to polish up their public image. They worked with the US Department of Defense. They had a 540 billion rand contract to make fake terrorism videos. So this was the same company that was hired by three brothers called the Gupta brothers. So they were a family that had come from India and set up in South Africa and sought to buy themselves influence. And the way they did it was sidling up to power. So they built a very symbiotic relationship with the former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma. And they were so close to him that they decided, who became ministers. When the public started being aware of what what the Gupta brothers were doing, and through exposés by the media, they hired Bell Pottinger in essence to clean up their image. And the campaign Bell Pottinger ran was to polarize South Africa's racial groups. So they scapegoated white people and said, white people are responsible for all the problems South Africa is facing. The reason why there is still a lot of inequality 20 years into our democracy is because of white people. Therefore, discounting the role of the ruling party in South Africa, or the governing party rather in South Africa, in not doing enough to make sure that that gap is closed. So the reaction from the public was anger. And a lot of the pushback happened to social media, so much so that Bell Pottinger shut down their social media accounts. I mean, that's how, if you can imagine a PR firm actually shutting down the social media account because of that public pushback. And it was one of those events which should have separated South Africans, but it actually united people, which was quite a heartwarming thing to see. It's such a pity that it had to happen through where people sought to manipulate our relationships as different race groups. So what it did is just that people were very angry about it. And then where I came in, so Bell Pottinger is part of the part of the Public Relations Association in the UK, where they had to follow a code of conduct. So we did quite a lot of research to find out how it is we can hold them accountable, and we reported them to this body. Obviously, they tried very hard. They work in narrative control and managing public perceptions. But
Van Dam, I'm very sorry to interrupt. If you could just take another minute or so to wrap up your reflections for us. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A with everyone. Thanks so much.
So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that it is important for everyone, regardless of where you stand in society, to take a stand against any racial polarization on social media. And we've seen it particularly for the Black Lives Matter movement, where it has given rise to white supremacy, where people who are just fighting for their rights have been made to look like they're completely mad. So I'm just interested in knowing what Black Lives Matter is doing, and really just to encourage you to continue doing what you're doing. People are listening, the world is watching, and to thank all of the US and people from different race groups, from different parts of the world in contributing to fight for equality.
Thank you so much. So the very first question that I want to ask is actually one for each of the panelists, but I'd sort of like to go around in turn and get your perspective from the different positions that you hold in society. Senator Hirono, you actually, right, are a very powerful senator. And I'm wondering, from your perspective as a powerful policymaker at the center of US politics, what sort of response you get from the platforms when you ask them for more information or you ask them to step up? Do you feel that they're being responsive? And then I'm going to go and ask, right, our other panelists the same questions, because I'm curious the difference between how we see the platforms responding to people in different positions around the country, and then really around the world.
About a year ago, the subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee on the Constitution had a hearing, the perspective being that these platforms eliminated conservative content. There's no evidence of that, but they did come and testify, and basically their position was that they were doing everything that they could. And of course, we have the Zuckerberg statement that they are not the arbiters of truth. However, I think that they are much more motivated to respond to the needs of accuracy on their platforms, and the fact that they're recognizing that their platforms are being used massively for misinformation and disinformation. And I think the added thing is, when you start having your major advertisers boycotting you, it causes you to pay attention. However, I don't think that's enough. But at the same time, you know, Facebook, the person from Facebook today said that they would comply with whatever Congress comes up with. That is way too late. So they have a responsibility right now to remove hate content, racist content from their platforms. And as I said, I hope that we will, in a bipartisan way, get to amending Section 230 so that they are not provided total immunity from doing any content moderation. But before that happens, we're running up to an election, and they have a responsibility to make sure that their platforms are not being used for misinformation and disinformation big time.
Secretary Benson, Senator Hirono has suggested that the platforms seem more motivated now. You're also in a position of power, but at the state level. Do you find that the platforms are responsive to your outreach, to your calls, and to your questions?
Increasingly so, but certainly it's notable that in the examples I gave earlier, the platforms were used, particularly Twitter, to enable the furthering of misinformation. Mm-hmm. In the first example, we reached out to Twitter and they said the post didn't violate their rules. In the second example, with scare tactics being posted online, Facebook didn't intervene in any way. And so, but in my view, that was March and May. Obviously, we're now, just about to begin July and get closer to November. My hope is that, particularly with all of us, folks, everyone represented here today and others continuing to raise awareness about it, they'll continue to be more responsive than they have been in the past. But certainly in the first part of this year, their responsiveness left a lot to be desired.
Agree.
Thank you. Kylie, when you were giving your opening remarks, you noted that many within your organization and allies, those allied with Black Lives Matter, have actually been flagging content and then sharing that with platforms. Do you find that they're actively and adequately responding to those and other measures that you're taking?
I think those platforms can certainly do a lot more. I haven't really experienced an increased level of diligence around thwarting misinformation and disinformation. As you point out, we certainly take this upon ourselves, utilizing our resources, our donor resources, to ensure that we are able to stay protected. We shouldn't have to. We're currently monitoring 1.5 million different accounts in the Black Lives Matter conversation to make sure that those accounts are destabilized if necessary. And these are actions that we're taking ourselves. We're also asking folks, if they see something, say something. So we've made it very clear on our website where people can take screenshots and send us very specific incidents of disinformation so that we can look into it further. So we're taking that really upon ourselves. I will say that there have been many incidences that we've experienced. You could read about many of them in the Mueller report. We've had incidents in 2019 with Russian trolls creating false accounts and a whole false news platform. In 2020, we've seen Russian actors outsource troll activities to areas of Ghana. We've seen a lot happening currently with the protests that are happening right now. We've seen disinformation targeted at activists around our work to help people with COVID activities and resources. And so we've seen a lot of this, and many of those times when a news story is about to break, many of the platforms alert us the day of or the day before. So I think that a lot of work still needs to be done in order to ensure that we are safe and protected, and that the discourse in society is regulated in a way that allows us to understand that the information that we're receiving is accurate and is not manipulated or fraudulent.
Hector, your organization, well, let's put it this way. Black Lives Matter is right at the forefront of public discussions in the US right now. You're allied with this organization, and yet not necessarily right at the forefront of discussion. Are the platforms as willing and interested to talk to grassroots civil society actors if they're not getting as much media attention?
Well, there are a lot of conversations with Facebook about these issues, and there are amazing advocates that have been dealing in these conversations and in these different tables. From my personal point of view, I've always been an advocate. My experience is that unless you create a structural pressure on these spaces, they never change nicely. They have very serious problems. So what I see right now, I fully welcome it. All the boycotts, all the pressure from Congress, all the mobilizations against Facebook. These are infrastructures that only all these different spaces, we continue putting pressure where it hurts the most, what is their income, and put also pressure in those corporations that invest heavily in these spaces. They will not change. The slight element of change that we have seen is in response to a lot of this serious public advocacy. And also there has been some internal compensation trying for them to invest in, these are kind of spaces and entities that never invest in, for example, in democracy. We have seen very small investments recently taking place. Those are spaces that have very serious problems with lack of diversity, serious lack of diversity historically, and are not, we just need to keep the accountability at a very high level and keep exposing the problems that they have if we want to keep seeing changes in the positive direction.
Thank you. And last but not least in this round of questions, MP Van Dam, you're situated in South Africa, and most of the attention, most of the discussion, even internationally, about the platform centers on the United States and at times Europe or the European Union. What's your experience of trying to reach out to the platforms from a country that doesn't necessarily always get nearly as much attention on the international scene?
Yeah, it's actually been relatively easy. We were able to reach out to Facebook when there are issues. They have an office in South Africa, so we have an open line to Facebook when there are issues, and they're always willing to engage. The only one we struggle with is Twitter. but we will be reaching out to them. But like I said, our work is really in collaboration with a lot of different players. So it's not only from us as legislators, but with journalists, with civil society. So it's a really collaborative effort, and we're looking forward to collaborating with some of the people who have spoken today, and hopefully sharing tactics that have worked from our side, and maybe they can share with us too.
What's the one thing that you would actually like the platforms to hear from you today?
So I think the attention is focused a lot on other countries. And I suppose, well, I'm here for South Africa, and I know what the situation is in South Africa. And we generally probably have a little bit more access than other African countries. I am quite interested in what's happening in other African countries where perhaps people have less access to companies like Facebook, where they have less access to the internet. So I would like for us to shine the light there. Where I suspect there is a lot of voter suppression, there's a lot of disinformation. So I think we need to be shining a light there.
I think that's an incredibly important message to share. And indeed, right, we've heard that different positions of power and different perspectives give different levels of access. And that's certainly something that should be corrected. Voter suppression is, as we've heard from our panelists and from our witnesses today, is an incredible problem in the US, but it's a problem around the world as well. Election integrity, as we heard during our previous panel earlier this morning, is also an international problem. I want to thank each of our panelists, our witnesses, for joining us here today. You've provided an incredibly important and powerful message. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, whether you're seated in the halls of power or are on the ground doing this work day in and day out. We are incredibly grateful for the time and energy that you devote to this important cause. I want to thank all of our members of the audience. Yes, I'm sorry.
Rebecca,
please go ahead.
Can I just say one thing? When we talk about removing hate speech and disinformation, etc., it should apply to the President of the United States, because he should not be exempted. He is the greatest perpetrator of hate speech, racist speech of anybody in our country, so he should not be exempted. I just needed to add that.
Thank you for your thoughts on this and everything else. And I hope that we have the opportunity to talk more about the specific legislative agenda that you've been putting forward as well. So again, thank you to all the members of our audience who watched today, whether you did so as journalists who were attendees in Zoom or were watching on the live stream. We will be having a third international forum on social media disinformation in mid to late July. So watch for information about that. The date is yet to be decided, but we're happy to share that widely. And from the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at the George Washington University, again, I'm the incoming director, Rebecca Trimble. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share this incredibly important message.